Julian Thorne looked at the digital guest list for the most important night of his life and did the unthinkable. With a single tap of his finger, he deleted his wife's name. He thought she was too plain, too simple, and too embarrassing to stand beside him at the Billionaire's Vanguard Gala. He thought he was protecting his image. He had no idea he was signing his own death warrant. He didn't know that the woman waiting at home in sweatpants wasn't just a housewife. He didn't know that the entire gala wasn't organized for him, but by her. When the doors of the grand hall finally opened, Julian didn't just lose his reputation. He realized he had been living in the shadow of a queen. And tonight, the queen was coming for her crown. The air in the penthouse office of Thorne Enterprises smelled of espresso, expensive leather, and arrogance. Julian Thorne, a man who had recently graced the cover of Forbes under the headline, "The Future of Tech," stood by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the grey skyline of Manhattan. He adjusted his bespoke cuffs, the gold links catching the dull afternoon light. "Sir, the final guest list for the Vanguard Gala is being sent to the printer in 10 minutes, his executive assistant, Marcus, said. Marcus was a young man, efficient and observant, who had been with the company long enough to see the cracks in the foundation that Julian ignored. Julian turned, walking back to the mahogany desk. "Let me see it one last time." Marcus handed over the tablet. Julian scrolled through the names. It was a who's who of the global elite. Senators, oil tycoons from Texas, tech moguls from Silicon Valley, and European royalty. It was the night Julian had been working toward for 5 years. Tonight, he wasn't just attending. He was the keynote speaker. He was expected to announce the merger that would make him a billionaire 3 times over. His finger paused on one name near the top of the VIP list. Mrs. Ilara Thorne. Julian's lip curled slightly. A mixture of annoyance and embarrassment flared in his chest. He thought of Ilara. Sweet, quiet Ilara. The woman who wore oversized sweaters, who spent her days tending to her garden on their Connecticut estate, and whose idea of a wild night was baking sourdough bread. She was the woman who had supported him when he was a broke college student. Yes, she had paid the rent when his first startup failed, but that was then. This was now. "She doesn't fit," Julian muttered to himself. "Sir?" Marcus asked, confused. "Ilara," Julian said, his voice cold. She's not ready for this crowd, Marcus. You know how she gets. She stands in the corner holding a glass of water. She doesn't know how to network. She wears dresses that look like they came from a department store rack. Tonight is about power. It's about image." Julian thought about the woman waiting for him in the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton right now. Isabella Ricci. Isabella was a model turned brand ambassador. She was sharp, hungry, and breathtakingly beautiful in a way that demanded attention. She knew how to laugh at bad jokes, how to whisper in the ears of investors, and exactly how to look good on his arm for the paparazzi. "Delete her," Julian said. Marcus blinked, stunned. "Delete? Mrs. Thorne? Sir, she's your wife. It's the Vanguard Gala. It's customary for spouses to—" "I said delete her," Julian snapped, slamming the tablet down on the desk. "I am the CEO of this company, Marcus. I decide who represents us. Ilara is a liability tonight. I need to close the deal with the Sterling Group. If Arthur Sterling sees me with a housewife who can't discuss macroeconomics, he'll think I'm soft. Delete her name. Remove her security clearance. If she shows up, she doesn't get in." Marcus hesitated, a look of deep discomfort crossing his face. He liked Ilara. She remembered his birthday when Julian didn't. She sent soup when he was sick. But he needed this job. "As you wish, Mr. Thorne," Marcus said, quietly, tapping the screen. Ilara Thorne deleted. Good. Julian straightened his tie, checking his reflection. I'll tell her the event was made, men only for the board members. She's gullible, she'll believe it. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. Send the car around for Miss Ricci. She's accompanying me tonight. Julian walked out of the office, feeling lighter. He felt powerful. He had trimmed the fat. He was ready to conquer the world. He had no idea that the notification of the deletion didn't just go to the event organizers. It went to a secure, encrypted server in a basement office in Zurich, a server owned by the holding company that secretly owned the majority share of Thorn Enterprises. And 5 minutes later, in the garden of their Connecticut estate, Elara Thorn's phone buzzed. Elara Thorn wiped the soil from her hands onto her apron. She was 32, with soft features and eyes the color of polished hazelnut. To the outside world and to her husband, she was Elara the homemaker, the orphan who got lucky marrying a rising star, the quiet woman who was content to stay in the background. She picked up her phone from the patio table. It was a secure alert. Alert: VIP guest access revoked. Name: Elara Thorn. Authorized by Julian Thorn. Elara stared at the screen. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She didn't throw the phone. Instead, the warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a chill that was absolute and terrifying. She swiped the notification away and opened a different app, one that required a fingerprint, a retinal scan, and a 16-digit passcode. The screen turned black, displaying a gold crest. The Aurora Group. The Aurora Group was a venture capital firm so exclusive it didn't have a website. It controlled shipping lines, pharmaceutical patents, and tech startups. 5 years ago, when Julian's first company was drowning in debt, the Aurora Group had swooped in with an anonymous injection of $50 million. Julian thought he had impressed a group of faceless Swiss investors. He never knew that Aurora was Elara's middle name. He never knew that the money he spent, the penthouse he lived in, and the genius reputation he built was all carefully orchestrated by the woman he had just deleted from a guest list because she was too plain. Elara pressed a contact named simply the Wolf. Mrs. Thorn, a gravelly voice answered immediately. It was Sebastian Vane, the head of legal and security for Aurora. We received the deletion log. Is it an error? No, Sebastian, Elara said, her voice changing. Gone was the soft, submissive tone she used with Julian. Her voice was now crisp, commanding, and dripping with authority. It appears my husband believes I am a liability to his image. Shall we cancel the funding for the merger? Sebastian asked. We can pull the plug on the Sterling deal within the hour. Thorn Enterprises will be bankrupt by midnight. No, Elara said, walking into her house. She untied her apron and let it drop to the floor. That's too easy. He wants an image. He wants power. I'm going to give him a lesson in power. She walked up the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing. Is the dress ready? The custom Givenchy. It arrived from Paris this morning, madam. It's in the vault. Good. And the car? The prototype Rolls-Royce is fueled and waiting at the hangar. Driver is on standby. Excellent. Elara reached her bedroom. She looked at the photo on the nightstand, a picture of her and Julian from 5 years ago. He looked adoringly at her then. Now, he looked through her. He had fallen in love with the money and the fame, forgetting who had given him the map to find them. Sebastian, she said into the phone. Yes, ma'am? Change my designation on the Gala guest list. I'm not going as wife of Julian Thorn. How shall I list you? Elara walked into her massive walk-in closet. She pushed aside the row of modest floral dresses Julian liked her to wear. She pressed a hidden panel in the wall. The back of the closet slid open, revealing a climate-controlled room filled with high-fashion couture, diamond sets worth millions, and deeds to properties Julian didn't even know existed. "List me," Ilara whispered, a dangerous smile touching her lips, as the chairman. It's time Julian met his boss. The Vanguard Gala was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The steps were draped in a crimson carpet, flanked by velvet ropes and hundreds of screaming paparazzi. Flashbulbs popped like lightning storms as limousines deposited the world's wealthiest people. Julian Thorne stepped out of a black Mercedes Maybach. He looked impeccable in a Tom Ford tuxedo, but the cameras weren't pointed at him immediately. They were pointed at the woman on his arm. Isabella Ricci was wearing a dress that was barely there, a shimmering silver gown with a slit that went up to her hip and a neckline that plunged dangerously low. She looked like a movie star. She soaked in the attention, blowing kisses to the press. "Julian! Julian!" a reporter from Vanity Fair shouted. "Over here! Who is the stunning lady?" Julian smiled, the smile of a man who thought he had won the lottery. He placed a possessive hand on Isabella's waist. "This is Isabella. She's consulting for Thorne Enterprises on our new branding." "Where is your wife, Ilara?" another reporter yelled. "We heard she was coming." Julian's face didn't twitch. He had practiced the lie in the car. He adopted a look of solemn concern. "Ilara is, unfortunately, under the weather tonight. She sends her regrets. Honestly, this high-paced world isn't really her scene. She prefers the quiet of home." "Is it true the sterling merger is happening tonight?" "You'll have to wait for the keynote speech," Julian winked, guiding Isabella up the stairs. Inside, the great hall was transformed, towering floral arrangements of white orchids, champagne flowing from crystal fountains, and a live orchestra playing soft jazz. The room was filled with sharks. Julian navigated the room, shaking hands. "Julian, my boy," a booming voice echoed. It was Arthur Sterling, the man Julian needed to impress. Sterling was 60, grey-haired, and built like a linebacker. He was the CEO of Sterling Industries. "Arthur?" Julian shook his hand firmly. "Wonderful evening." Arthur looked at Isabella, then back at Julian. His eyebrows knitted together. "I thought Ilara was coming. I was looking forward to meeting her. My wife is a big fan of her. Charitable work." Julian laughed nervously. "Charitable work? Ilara mostly just gardens?" "No, she's sick. Migraine. Terrible thing. This is Isabella, my, creative director." Arthur Sterling didn't smile. He looked at Isabella, who was checking her makeup in the reflection of a spoon, and then looked at Julian with a strange mix of pity and suspicion. "I see. Well, the board of the Aurora Group is sending a representative tonight to oversee the signing. A special guest. Did you know?" Julian paused. "Aurora. They usually just send lawyers. Who is it?" "I don't know." Arthur lowered his voice. "But rumors say the chairman is coming in person. No one has ever seen him. They say he holds the deed to half of Manhattan." Julian felt a thrill of excitement. If he could impress the chairman of the Aurora Group, his power would be absolute. "I'll make sure to charm him, whoever he is." "I'm sure you will," Arthur said dryly, moving away. Julian grabbed a glass of champagne and turned to Isabella. "Did you hear that? The chairman is coming. This is it, Bella. After tonight, I won't just be rich. I'll be untouchable." Isabella giggled, running a finger down his lapel. "You're already a king, baby. Forget about that boring wife of yours. Tonight is our coronation." Suddenly, the music stopped. The murmur of the crowd died down. The massive oak doors at the top of the grand staircase, which had been closed, began to rumble. The head of security for the gala stepped into the middle of the room with a microphone. He looked nervous. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed, Please clear the center aisle. We have a priority arrival." "Who could it be?" Isabella whispered. "The president?" Julian scoffed. "Probably the chairman of Aurora. Watch this. I'm going to be the first to shake his hand." Julian stepped forward, dragging Isabella with him, positioning himself right at the base of the stairs. He wanted the photo op. The CEO of Thorn Enterprises greeting the mysterious investor. The doors groaned open. But it wasn't an old Swiss banker in a suit who stepped out. The silhouette was feminine. The figure stepped into the light. A collective gasp rippled through the room, so loud it sucked the oxygen out of the air. The woman standing at the top of the stairs was wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet, encrusted with real crushed diamonds that caught the chandelier light like a galaxy. It was regal, imposing, and utterly breathtaking. Her hair, usually tied in a messy bun, was cascading in sleek Hollywood waves. Around her neck sat the heart of the ocean, or a sapphire so large it looked like it. She didn't look down. She looked straight ahead, with eyes like cold steel. Julian dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the floor, spraying shards over Isabella's shoes, but neither of them noticed. Julian squinted. His brain couldn't process what he was seeing. It looked like Ilara, but it couldn't be. Ilara was at home. Ilara was plain. Ilara was deleted. The woman began to descend the stairs. Every step was calculated. Every movement screamed power. The master of ceremonies announced, his voice trembling slightly, "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the founder and chairman of the Aurora Group, Mrs. Ilara Vance Thorn." The silence that followed was deafening. Julian felt his knees buckle. Isabella looked at him, eyes wide. "I thought you said she was a housewife." Ilara reached the bottom of the stairs. She stopped 3 feet in front of Julian. She didn't look at him. She looked through him, directly at Arthur Sterling, who was bowing his head in respect. Then, slowly, she turned her gaze to her husband. "Hello, Julian," she said. Her voice was amplified by the acoustics of the room, smooth and deadly. "I believe there was a mistake with the guest list. You seem to have erased me. So I decided to buy the venue." The flashbulbs were blinding, but Julian felt like he was standing in pitch darkness. The air in the grand hall had grown thick, suffocating. He looked at Ilara. No, this wasn't Ilara. This was a stranger wearing his wife's face. The Ilara he knew wore cotton pajamas and smelled of vanilla. This woman smelled of oud wood and cold, hard cash. She stood taller, her posture regal, her chin tilted up as if the world were waiting for her permission to spin. "By the venue?" Julian stammered, his confident CEO voice reduced to a pathetic squeak. "Ilara, what are you talking about? You're hallucinating. You need to go home. You're embarrassing yourself." He reached out to grab her arm, a reflex of control he had used 1,000 times before. Before his fingers could graze the velvet of her gown, a massive hand intercepted his wrist. It was Sebastian Vane, the man Julian thought was just a faceless lawyer for the Aurora Group. In person, Sebastian was 6'4", with a scar running through his eyebrow and a grip like a hydraulic press. "I wouldn't touch the chairman if I were you, Mr. Thorn," Sebastian growled, his voice low enough that only they could hear, but menacing enough to make Julian flinch. Isabella Ricci, sensing her moment in the spotlight was fading, stepped forward. She flipped her hair, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Oh, please, this is ridiculous. Julian, tell your little housewife to go back to her gardening. This is a business gala, not a costume party. Who does she think she is? Crashing our night." Ilara finally shifted her gaze to Isabella. She didn't look angry. She didn't look jealous. She looked at Isabella the way a scientist looks at a bacteria sample in a petri dish, mildly interesting, but ultimately insignificant. "Isabella Ricci," Ilara said, her voice calm. "Former runway model for Versace. Dropped in 2021 for unprofessional conduct. Currently barely making rent on a studio apartment in Soho, which, incidentally, is owned by a subsidiary of the Aurora Group." Isabella's jaw dropped. "How do you—" "I know everything, my dear," Ilara said, stepping closer. "I know you've been charging your Uber rides to Julian's corporate card. I know you're wearing a loner dress that has to be returned by 9 a.m. tomorrow. And I know you think you've caught a big fish." Ilara glanced at Julian, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "But you didn't catch a whale, Isabella. You caught a remora, a parasite attached to a much larger host." Ilara turned her back on them, facing the crowd of stunned billionaires. "Arthur," she said, extending a hand to Arthur Sterling. Arthur Sterling, the titan of industry, didn't hesitate. He took her hand and kissed the ring, a sapphire signet ring with the Aurora crest. "Madam Chairman, I had heard rumors the Aurora Group was led by a woman, but I never suspected. Well, it is an honor." "The honor is mine, Arthur," Ilara smiled, a dazzling professional smile that Julian had never seen. "I apologize for the delay. My husband seemed to have misplaced my invitation. Shall we proceed to the main table? We have a merger to discuss." But I'm the keynote speaker," Julian shouted, desperation clawing at his throat. "This is my company, Thorn Enterprises." Ilara paused. She turned her head slightly over her shoulder. "Is it Julian?" she asked softly. "Who paid off your initial loans? Aurora. Who bought the patents for your tech? Aurora. Who covers the insurance policies? Aurora. You are the face, Julian. A handsome face, I'll admit. But I am the spine, and tonight I think it's time for a spinal tap." She walked away, arm in arm with Arthur Sterling, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. Julian was left standing at the foot of the stairs, the shards of his broken champagne glass crunching under his polished shoes. The dinner service was an exercise in torture for Julian. Usually he sat at the head of the table, the center of attention. Tonight, the seating chart had been digitally rearranged in real time. Ilara sat at the head of the platinum table, flanked by Arthur Sterling and the Senator of New York. Julian found his name card at table 42. It was near the kitchen doors. Isabella had vanished. The moment she realized Julian wasn't the power player, she had slipped away into the crowd, likely looking for a new target. Julian was alone. He watched from across the room as Ilara laughed at something Arthur said. She looked radiant. She was drinking vintage Pinot Noir, a wine Julian had told her was too complex for her palate just last week. She was speaking fluent French to the diplomat on her left. Julian didn't even know she spoke French. He couldn't take it anymore. Fueled by humiliation and 3 glasses of whiskey, Julian stood up and marched across the room. The murmuring stopped as he approached the head table. "Enough!" Julian slammed his hand down on the white tablecloth, rattling the silverware. "Stop the act, Ilara. You've had your fun. You've embarrassed me. Now, sign the papers with Arthur so I can go home." Arthur Sterling looked up, unimpressed. "Julian, we are in the middle of a discussion about global supply chains, something you struggled to explain in our last meeting." "She doesn't know anything about supply chains," Julian spat, pointing a shaking finger at his wife. "She sits at home and plants hydrangeas. I built this company. Me! I worked 18-hour days." Ilara set her wine glass down. The sound of the glass touching the table echoed in the silent hall. "You worked 18-hour days?" Ilara asked quietly. "Let's clarify that, shall we? You spent 4 hours in the office. You spent 3 hours at lunch. You spent 2 hours at the gym. And you spent the rest of the time entertaining clients like Isabella. That's a lie, is it? Ilara gestured to the massive screen behind the stage, usually reserved for the keynote presentation. She pressed a button on a small remote concealed in her hand. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't a PowerPoint about profits. It was a series of financial documents. These, Ilara narrated, her voice projecting clearly, are the unauthorized withdrawals from the Thorn Enterprises R&D Fund. $2 million transferred to an offshore account in the Caymans. $1 million spent on a consulting fee to a shell company owned by Miss Ricci. The crowd gasped. This was corporate embezzlement. This was prison time. And this, Ilara clicked the button again. A video played. It was security footage from Julian's office. The audio was crisp. Julian's voice on the recording. I don't care about the safety protocols. Just bypass the regulations. If the battery explodes, we'll blame the supplier. I need the stock price to hit $400 by the Gala so I can cash out and divorce Ilara. She's dead weight. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a grave. Julian stared at the screen, his face draining of color. He looked like a ghost. Where? How did you get that? I own the building, Julian, Ilara said, standing up. She towered over him, even though he was taller. Her presence was mountainous. I own the servers. I own the cameras. I own the very chair you sit in. Did you really think you could steal from my company, plan to leave me destitute, and erase me from my own life without me noticing? She leaned in close, her voice a whisper that screamed. I watered you like a plant, Julian. I gave you sunlight. I gave you soil. But you turned out to be a weed. And you know what I do to weeds? I pluck them out, Ilara finished. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the acoustic perfection of the Metropolitan Museum's Grand Hall, it struck with the force of a gavel. The room, filled with the titans of industry, was frozen in a tableau of shock. Waiters stopped pouring wine. The string quartet, sensing the violence in the air, had lowered their bows. Julian Thorne stood by the head table, his face a mask of fracturing plaster. He looked at the screen where his secret offshore accounts were still displayed in high definition, red numbers glowing like fresh wounds. He looked at Arthur Sterling, whose face had turned a shade of purple, usually reserved for bruised fruit. Then he looked at Ilara. For a moment, the old Julian resurfaced, the master manipulator who had charmed investors and seduced the press for a decade. He forced a laugh. It was a wet, jagged sound that grated on the nerves. This, Julian gestured wildly at the screen, turning to face the crowd. This is incredible theater. Bravo, Ilara. Really, I'm impressed. He walked toward Arthur Sterling, spreading his hands in a gesture of camaraderie. Arthur, gentlemen, surely you see what this is. It's a deep fake, AI generation. My wife has evidently hired some very expensive hackers to create a smear campaign because she's emotional. We're going through a rough patch at home. She's hysterical. He leaned in closer to the microphone, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You know how women get when they feel neglected. They invent stories. They seek attention. I built Thorn Enterprises from a garage. Do you really think I would jeopardize my life's work for pocket change? A murmur went through the crowd. It was the sound of doubt. Julian was charismatic. He was one of them. For a terrifying second, it seemed his gaslighting might work. Ilara didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She simply tapped the tablet she was holding. Pocket change? Ilara asked, her voice cutting through his performance. Let's talk about the battery protocol, Julian. On the massive screen behind her, the financial documents vanished. They were replaced by a grainy, black and white video feed. The timestamp was from 3 weeks ago. The location, the executive lounge of the Ritz-Carlton. Julian froze. His blood ran cold. He remembered that night. He had been drinking with the CFO of a rival tech firm, bragging. The video played. The audio was crystal clear. Julian, on screen, holding a scotch. The engineers are whining about the thermal runaway on the new Model X phone battery. They say if it charges for more than 4 hours, there's a 5% chance it catches fire. Rival CFO, off-screen. Jesus, Julian. You're going to delay the launch? Julian, laughing, taking a sip. Delay? And miss the Q4 bonus? Hell no, we ship it. If a few phones melt, we blame the user. We call it improper charging habits. I've already drafted the press release. As long as the stock hits $400 by the Gala, I'm cashing out anyway. I'll be divorced and living in Monaco before the first lawsuit hits. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of absolute, unadulterated disgust. Arthur Sterling stood up slowly. He was a man who had ruthlessly acquired companies, a man who was no stranger to corporate warfare. But he was also a man who prided himself on honor. He looked at Julian as if he were looking at something he had scraped off his shoe. You were going to let them burn, Arthur said, his voice trembling with rage. My granddaughter uses a Thorn phone. You were going to let it explode in her hands for a quarterly bonus? Arthur, wait, that's out of context, Julian stammered, backing away as the older man advanced. It was locker room talk. It was a joke. Security, Arthur roared, slamming his fist onto the table. Get this criminal out of my sight before I forget I'm a civilized man. 2 uniformed guards stepped forward from the shadows, but Alara raised her hand. They stopped instantly. She was the commander-in-chief tonight. Not yet, Alara said softly. She walked around the table, the train of her midnight blue gown sweeping across the floor. She approached Julian. He was trembling now, sweat beading on his forehead, ruining his makeup. You called me hysterical, Julian, Alara said, standing toe-to-toe with him. You said I was emotional. But look at the facts. I saved the company you tried to destroy. I protected the customers you viewed as collateral damage. I am the only reason you aren't already in handcuffs. Alara, please. Julian's voice cracked, shifting instantly from arrogance to pathetic begging. He grabbed her hand, his palms clammy. Alara, baby, listen to me. I was drunk. I didn't mean it. The stress, the pressure, it broke me. You know me. I'm your husband. We're a team. Remember the cottage? Remember our vows? He fell to his knees, sobbing theatrically, clutching the fabric of her dress. I'll fix it. I'll fire Isabella. I'll donate the money. Just don't let them take me. Don't ruin me. I love you, Alara. I've always loved you. The crowd watched, mesmerized. It was a pathetic display. The king of tech was on his knees, weeping into velvet. Alara looked down at him. Her face was unreadable. For a fleeting second, a memory flashed in her mind. Julian bringing her soup when she had the flu, years ago. Julian holding her hand at her mother's funeral. But then, she looked at the screen again. She saw the timestamp. 3 weeks ago. While he was planning to let phones explode, she had been planning his birthday party. She gently, but firmly, pulled her dress from his grip. You don't love me, Julian, she said, her voice filled with a profound, final sadness. You love the way I make you look. You love the safety net I provide. But you cut the net. She turned to Sebastian Vane, the imposing head of security who had been waiting in the wings like a gargoyle. Mr. Vane, Yes, Madam Chairman? Remove him. Sebastian stepped forward, grabbing Julian by the upper arm. It wasn't a gentle escort. It was a vice grip. Julian yelped. No, get off me! I'm the CEO! You work for me! Julian screamed, thrashing as Sebastian and another guard dragged him backward toward the grand exit. Elara, tell them to stop. I own this company. I own 51%. Elara picked up the microphone from the podium. She didn't shout. She spoke clearly, addressing his retreating figure. Actually, Julian, she said, Clause 14, Section B of the Founding Charter. In the event of gross negligence or criminal intent by the CEO, the primary investor retains the right to invoke the clean slate protocol. The what? Julian screamed, digging his heels into the red carpet. Sebastian, Elara commanded. Execute protocol. Sebastian tapped his earpiece. Execute. At that exact moment, Julian's phone, which was in the breast pocket of his tuxedo, began to vibrate violently. It wasn't just a call. It was a cascade of notifications. Julian managed to rip his arm free for 1 second. He pulled out his phone, desperate to call his lawyer. He stared at the screen. Notification. Face ID not recognized. Notification. Apple Pay. Card declined. Notification. American Express. Account closed by issuer. Notification. Tesla key. Access revoked. Notification. Penthouse smart lock. User. Julian. Deleted. What are you doing? Julian shrieked, staring at the device as it essentially turned into a brick in his hands. My accounts! My car! Everything you have, Elara said, her voice echoing through the hall, was leased in the company's name. The car, the apartment, the credit cards, even the phone in your hand. Julian looked up, terror in his eyes. But my money, my personal savings. Your personal savings were transferred to the Cayman Islands, Elara reminded him, which, thanks to the Patriot Act and the evidence of fraud I just uploaded to the FBI server 3 minutes ago, have been frozen pending a federal investigation. The color drained from Julian's face so completely he looked like a corpse. You called the feds? I didn't have to call them, Elara said, gesturing to the back of the room. They were on the guest list. I just undeleted them. At the back of the hall, 4 men in windbreakers with FBI printed on the back stepped forward. They had been waiting for the evidence to be public. Julian's legs gave out. He went limp. The security guards didn't struggle anymore. They simply dragged him. As he was hauled past the tables of his former peers, people he had laughed with, drank with, plotted with, they turned their backs, one by one. It was a wave of rejection. No one looked at him. He was already a ghost. At the massive oak doors, Julian found one last reserve of venom. He twisted his neck, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. You're nothing without me, he screamed, his voice cracking, raw and ugly. You can't run this. You're just a gardener. You're just a housewife. You'll burn this company to the ground in a week. Elara stood alone on the stage. The spotlight hit her, making the diamonds on her neck blaze like stars. She looked at the man she had wasted 10 years on. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked powerful. I am not a housewife, Julian, she said into the microphone, her voice calm, resonant, and final. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. I am the house, and the house always wins. The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off Julian's final scream. For 3 seconds, there was silence. Then Arthur Sterling began to clap. It was a slow, rhythmic clap. Then the senator joined in. Then the models. Then the waitstaff. Within moments, the entire Metropolitan Museum of Art was shaking with thunderous applause. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar of approval. Elara didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply nodded to Marcus, her assistant. "Clean up this mess," she whispered, gesturing to the shattered champagne glass on the floor where Julian had stood. "And serve the dessert. I believe we have a merger to sign." 6 months later. The autumn rain in Manhattan was relentless, turning the city into a blur of grey steel and neon lights. But inside the penthouse office of the newly christened Aurora Thorn Industries, the atmosphere was warm, vibrant, and ruthlessly efficient. Elara Thorn sat behind a desk that was more of a command station than a piece of furniture. It was carved from a single slab of white marble, cool to the touch, devoid of the clutter that had once plagued Julian's workspace. Gone were the ego-stroking magazine covers and the useless accolades. In their place were holographic schematics of a new sustainable energy grid and a single framed photograph of a small cottage in Connecticut, a reminder of where she found her peace. "Madame CEO," Marcus's voice came through the intercom. The title still sent a small, satisfying electric current through Elara's spine. Marcus had flourished in the last half-year. No longer the terrified assistant fetching coffee, he was now the vice president of operations, wearing a suit that actually fit, and walking with the confidence of a man who knew his job was secure. "Yes, Marcus," Elara replied, swiping a profit projection off her screen. "The legal team is here, and he has arrived." Elara paused. Her hand hovered over the digital stylus. She had known this day was coming, the finalization of the divorce proceedings. It was a formality, really. The prenuptial agreement, combined with the overwhelming evidence of Julian's corporate embezzlement and infidelity, meant there was very little to discuss. But Julian, in a last-ditch effort to salvage his ego, had demanded an in-person meeting to sign the final dissolution of partnership papers. "Send them in," Elara said, her voice steady. "And Marcus?" "Yes, ma'am?" "Have security on standby. Not in the room, just outside. I don't want a scene, but I won't tolerate a circus." "Understood. They are on their way up." Elara stood and walked to the window. The view was the same one Julian had looked out of the night he deleted her name. But the city looked different now. It didn't look like a kingdom to be conquered. It looked like a complex machine that she was finally running correctly. Since taking over, stock prices had surged 45%. The Julian Thorn innovation that the media used to praise turned out to be a bottleneck. Without his micromanagement and fear-mongering, the engineers were finally free to create. The elevator doors chimed. Elara turned. Her lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Catherine Pierce, who was known in legal circles as the Guillotine, entered first. And then, trailing behind her like a ghost, haunting his own grave, came Julian. The transformation was shocking, even to Elara. 6 months ago, Julian Thorn had been the picture of vitality. He had glowed with the sheen of expensive moisturizers, personal trainers, and the arrogance of a man who had never heard the word no. The man standing before her now looked hollowed out. His suit was off the rack, ill-fitting at the shoulders and slightly frayed at the cuff. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and dull. But it was his eyes that told the real story. The fire was gone. In its place was a muddy mixture of resentment, exhaustion, and a desperate, clawing hope. "Elara," Julian said. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, trying to summon the ghost of his old authority. "You changed the decor. It's a bit cold, isn't it?" "It's efficient," Elara said, not inviting him to sit. "Sit down, Julian. Let's get this over with. I have a board meeting in 20 minutes. Julian flinched at the dismissal. He sat in the chair opposite her, a chair that was noticeably lower than hers. A subtle psychological tactic Elara had implemented for all negotiations. Catherine Pierce slid a thick black folder across the marble desk. Mr. Thorne, as per the mediation, this is the final decree. You are surrendering all claims to Thorne Enterprises, the Connecticut estate, and the Manhattan penthouse. In exchange, Mrs. Thorne has graciously agreed to absorb the outstanding legal fees for your embezzlement trial, provided you plead no contest and accept the probation deal. Julian stared at the papers. His hands were shaking. I built this, he whispered, looking around the room. I picked out those sconces. I chose the carpet in the hallway. You chose the decor, Julian, Ilara corrected him, gently but firmly. I paid for it. There is a difference. Julian looked up, his eyes wet. Is that all I was to you? An investment? A project? Ilara sighed. She walked around the desk, leaning against the edge, looking down at him. No, Julian. You were my husband. I loved you. I loved you enough to hide my light so yours wouldn't be shadowed. I loved you enough to let you take credit for my strategies. I loved you enough to let you believe you were the king, while I quietly laid every brick of the castle. She crossed her arms. But you didn't want a partner. You wanted a prop. And when you thought the prop wasn't shiny enough for your big night, you tried to throw it in the trash. You didn't realize that without the prop, the whole stage collapses. I made a mistake, Julian burst out, the desperation finally breaking through. One mistake. I was stressed. Isabella meant nothing. She was just a distraction. I can change, Ilara. Look at me. I've lost everything. Isn't that punishment enough? Take me back. Not as CEO, just give me a job. I can work in sales. I can consult. Please, I'm drowning out there. He leaned forward, his face pale. Do you know where I'm working? A used car lot in Queens, Ilara. Queens. I'm selling Civics to college kids who don't even know who I am. Last week, a customer threw a coffee at me because the transmission failed. Me? Julian Thorne? Ilara looked at him, and for a moment, she searched her heart for pity. She looked for that familiar tug of guilt that had controlled her for a decade. She found nothing. It wasn't that she was cruel. It was just that she had finally grown up. She realized that saving Julian from the consequences of his actions wasn't love, it was enabling. You're good at sales, Julian, she said objectively. You sold me a dream for 10 years that turned out to be a lemon. You'll do fine in Queens. Julian's face hardened. The sorrow evaporated, replaced by a flash of the old, nasty malice. You think you've won, don't you? You think you're some feminist icon. But you'll always be the woman who couldn't keep her husband happy. You'll be alone in this tower. Cold and alone. Ilara smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized the weather had cleared. Catherine, Ilara said to her lawyer. Does he have a pen? Catherine handed Julian a pen. He gripped it like a dagger, stared at the signature line, and for a second, he hesitated. He looked at the office one last time. He looked at the life he had incinerated, because he was too insecure to share the spotlight. He signed. The scratching of the pen on paper was the loudest sound in the room. Done! Julian slammed the pen down. He stood up, smoothing his cheap jacket. I'm leaving. I hope you choke on your money, Ilara. Goodbye, Julian, Ilara said, turning her back to him to look out the window again. She heard his footsteps retreat. She heard the heavy oak door open and close. And then, silence. But it wasn't a lonely silence. It was a peaceful one. Catherine, Ilara said without turning around. Did the transfer go through? Yes, Madam Chairman. The moment he signed, the final trust fund payment was authorized. He doesn't know it yet, but you put $200,000 in an account for him. Why? After everything he said? Ilara watched the rain streak against the glass. Because I'm not him. I don't destroy people just because I can. That money will keep him off the street, but it won't buy him a way back in. It's a severance package for a failed employee. Nothing more. Catherine chuckled, gathering her files. You're a better woman than I am, Ilara. I would have let him starve. I'm not better, Ilara whispered to the glass. I'm just finished. Later that afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the city scrubbed clean and glistening under a breaking sun. Ilara stepped out of the lobby of Aurora Thorne Tower. Your car is ready, madame, the valet said, holding open the door of the silver Rolls-Royce. No, thank you, James, Ilara said, adjusting her scarf. I think I'll walk today. Walk, ma'am, but the paparazzi. Let them snap their pictures, Ilara said, putting on her sunglasses. I have nothing to hide. She walked onto the sidewalk, merging into the flow of New York City. For years she had walked with her head down, trying to avoid being noticed, trying not to embarrass Julian. Today, she walked with a stride that commanded space. She passed a newsstand. The cover of Business Weekly featured her face, not a side profile, not a blurry paparazzi shot, but a studio portrait she had commissioned. The headline read, The Silent Architect Speaks, How Ilara Thorne Saved a $1 billion Empire. She paused for a moment, looking at it. Beside the stack of magazines was a tabloid. The headline there was smaller, tucked in the corner. Fallen tech bro Julian Thorne. Spotted eating sandwich on curb. Ilara felt a vibration in her pocket. She pulled out her phone. It was a text from Arthur Sterling. Arthur. The European delegation is asking if you can fly to Paris next week for the summit. They want to discuss the clean energy patent. Also, my wife wants to know if you'd like to join us for dinner tonight. No business, just wine. Ilara typed back, Tell the delegation I'll be there. And tell your wife to open the good Cabernet. I'm bringing dessert. She put the phone away and turned a corner, entering Central Park. The noise of the city faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves. She made her way to the conservatory garden. 6 months ago, she had been a woman defined by who she was married to. She had been Julian's wife, a deletion on a guest list, an inconvenience. She stopped in front of a massive bed of blooming hydrangeas, blue, purple, and pink, exploding in a riot of color. She reached out and touched a petal. It was delicate, yet resilient. It had survived the winter to bloom in the sun. A young girl, maybe 20 years old, was sitting on a bench nearby, sketching the flowers. She looked up and saw Ilara. Her eyes went wide. "Excuse me?" the girl stammered. Are you Ilara Thorne?" Ilara looked down, surprised. "I am." The girl scrambled to stand up, dropping her sketchbook. "Oh my God! I saw your speech at the shareholders' meeting online, the one about owning your own value. I just wanted to say, thank you. My boyfriend told me my art was a waste of time, that I should just help him with his startup. I broke up with him this morning because of you." Ilara felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at the girl, so young, so full of potential, standing on the precipice of the same mistake Ilara had made. "What is your name?" Ilara asked. "Sophie." Ilara reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. It was heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing. "Sophie," Ilara said, handing her the card. "When you finish your portfolio, call this number. Aurora Thorne is looking for creative consultants for our new branding. We need people who understand that art isn't a waste of time. It's the soul of innovation." Sophie stared at the card, her hands trembling. Thank you. Thank you so much." Don't thank me, Ilara smiled, and this time the smile reached her eyes, lighting them up like the diamond she now wore openly. Just promise me one thing. Anything, Sophie breathed. Never let anyone delete you from your own story. If they try to erase you, you pick up the pen and you write them out of the next chapter. Ilara turned and walked away down the winding path, the afternoon sun casting a long, strong shadow in front of her. She wasn't going home to an empty house. She was going home to a life that was finally, completely, and unapologetically full. Julian thought power came from a title, a suit, and a guest list. He learned the hard way that real power isn't loud. It doesn't need to shout to be heard. Real power is the quiet confidence of the person who holds the keys to the castle while everyone else is just renting a room. Ilara Thorne showed the world that you should never mistake silence for weakness, and you should never, ever delete the person who built your throne. What would you have done if you were Ilara? Would you have taken him back when he begged on his knees, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of sweet revenge and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. We have a shocking new drama coming tomorrow that involves a cheating groom and a secret microphone. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful who you underestimate.